So, when countries get paid for protecting their forests? That's what we call results-based payments. But here's the thing. To unlock that funding, they can't just say they're doing a good job. They need a super credible, internationally accepted way to prove their actions are actually working. This isn't about good intentions. It's about auditable proof. And that's exactly where this technical blueprint comes in. Okay, let's dive into it. So that really brings us to the million-dollar question, or in this case, the multi-million-dollar question. It's where the science really meets the finance. How do you measure, report, and then verify something as huge and complex as an entire nation's forests to prove you're delivering results that are actually worth paying for? Well, the answer lies in a really powerful and very carefully scrutinized framework. All right, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll cover what a National Forest Monitoring System, or NFMS, actually is. Then, we're going to look at its two core pillars, dive deep into how each of them works, see how all that raw data gets turned into credible results, and finally, we'll tie it all together and see why these systems are so incredibly important for unlocking climate finance. So, first things first, what in the world is an NFMS? Well, you can think of it as the foundation. It's the absolute bedrock that all credible and therefore fundable climate action in forests is built on. At its heart, an NFMS is a systematic framework. Now, it's not just one single tool, but a whole system that's designed to do two main things. First, record what's happening to the land, and second, and this is the critical part, develop hard data that quantifies greenhouse gas emissions and removals. It's really the engine that assesses performance and ultimately determines the payment. Now, to really get a handle on the architecture of an NFMS, you've got to understand that it basically stands on two distinct but deeply connected pillars. Let's take a closer look at the blueprint for producing these financially relevant results. And this picture here illustrates the entire system perfectly. See, on the left, you've got the monitoring function, and on the right, you've got the MRV function. You can see how they both pull in inputs, like satellite data, but they work together to produce different but complementary outputs. This diagram is basically our roadmap for the rest of this explainer. Okay, so this is the crucial difference right here. It's all about the questions they answer. Monitoring is about the what. What is happening on the ground? It tracks the activities themselves. But MRV, on the other hand, is all about the how much. It's there to quantify the actual carbon impact. So one observes, the other quantifies. You absolutely need both to make a credible claim. The what shows you're taking action, but it's the how much that unlocks the funding. All right, let's zoom in on our first pillar, the monitoring function. This is all about building a comprehensive, multi-layered picture of what is really happening across the entire forest landscape. So the monitoring toolkit is pretty diverse. You've got this top-down view from satellite land monitoring systems that spots broad changes, but then you also have web interfaces for transparency. You pull in existing national systems, and this is a vital piece, you have a bottom-up component, community monitoring. It's all about creating a record that is just undeniable. Now, this is a fantastic real-world example of how you make transparency tangible. What you're seeing is the Papua New Guinea REDD Plus web portal. Anyone, anywhere, can go online and see the data on forest change. And this isn't just about good practice, it's smart business. This level of openness is what gives international partners and investors the confidence to provide funding. They can literally see the data for themselves. And we really can't overstate how important community monitoring is. I mean, satellites can see a lot, but they can't tell you why a forest is changing. Local knowledge provides that crucial detail. It helps validate the satellite data, and it builds local support. This ground truthing just makes the data that much more robust, which helps prevent disputes and makes the final claim so much stronger. Okay, so we've seen what's happening on the ground. Now we're going to pivot to Pillar 2, the MRV function. This is where we translate those observed changes into the hard numbers of climate impact, the tons of carbon dioxide equivalent that ultimately get you paid. So the whole process kicks off with something called activity data. This is really the what and where part of the carbon equation. It's all about the extent of an activity. For example, how many hectares of forest were lost, or maybe how many were gained. This is the first, absolutely crucial input for that carbon accounting ledger. But just knowing the area of change isn't nearly enough. We need the second big piece of the puzzle, the emission factor. This tells us the carbon intensity of that change. In other words, how much carbon is released for every single hectare that's lost. This critical data comes from people on the ground doing measurements, and its accuracy is everything. A flawed emission factor leads directly to a flawed financial claim. And this slide just puts it all together beautifully. It's a simple formula with huge implications. You take your activity data, the area of change from satellites, and you multiply it by the emission factor, the carbon per area from inventories. And what you get is your official greenhouse gas inventory. It's really that simple and that complex. This is the little formula that underpins multi-million-dollar transactions. Ethiopia is a great case study for this. By conducting their own national forest inventory, they developed emission factors that were specific to their unique forests. And what they found was that a lot of the global default estimates were just plain wrong for their context. This really highlights why country-specific data is so key for accuracy, and that accuracy translates directly to a more precise and defensible financial claim for their results. So, we have the final numbers. But how do we get from a spreadsheet to getting those results certified for payment on the world stage? Well, this is where a really strict set of international accounting principles comes into play. The rules of the game are set by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. For any national inventory to be considered robust and credible, it has to be 5 things: transparent, consistent, complete, comparable, and accurate. You can basically think of these as the international accounting standards for carbon, and they are absolutely non-negotiable. If you don't meet them, your results won't be recognized and payments simply won't be made. Okay, let's bring this all home. Why does all this technical detail matter so much? It's because a robust national forest monitoring system is the absolute cornerstone for turning forest protection into a financially viable climate solution. Without it, the whole thing falls apart. And this quote from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change really says it all. This isn't just some guideline. It's the political and financial foundation for the entire results-based payment system. Words like demonstrable, transparent, and verifiable, those are the basis for financial trust. And without the kind of system we've just walked through, none of that is even possible. So let's just quickly recap the most important takeaways. An NFMS isn't optional, it's a core requirement for REDD+. It works using 2 main functions. Monitoring tells us what is going on, and MRV tells us how much carbon is involved. It's built on satellite data, ground-based inventories, and greenhouse gas accounting, and it's all held to the highest standards by the IPCC guidelines, which is what makes the data bankable in the first place. And that leaves us with a really interesting question to think about. These systems are constantly evolving. So the big challenge and the big opportunity is figuring out how we can better merge cutting-edge technology with the invaluable on-the-ground knowledge of local communities to paint an even clearer, more accurate, and more powerful picture of our planet's forests.